Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. After more than 2 decades in which China became the world's factory, it might seem surprising that anyone is still shocked by the impact of the country's economic growth. But over the last year or so, there's been much talk in Europe of what's being called the China Shock 2.0. It's a reference to a phrase first used in the 2000s, after China joined the World Trade Organization and the country's surging exports began to lead to factory closures, most notably in the US and Europe. Now, with China's global trade surplus at around $1.2 trillion, it's the European Union in particular, which accounts for around a third of that surplus, that's feeling the pain, as China's increasingly high-tech industry moves into areas previously dominated by countries like Germany, such as cars, green technology and heavy machinery. German industrial output has fallen around 10% over the past 4 years, and the country is estimated to be losing some 10,000 industrial jobs every month. Much of the blame has been placed on Chinese overcapacity and what Europe sees as unfair subsidies. The French President Emmanuel Macron said recently that Chinese exports are literally killing a large part of European industry. And with fears that job losses and the resulting economic pressures and sometimes cuts in welfare could further boost the rise of the far right in European politics, there have been calls, notably in a report by the think tank the Centre for European Reform, for new import restrictions and higher tariffs to be imposed on Chinese goods by the European Union. It's something the German government in particular has traditionally shied away from, fearing Chinese retribution and the fallout for German investment in China. Now, in an attempt to find a solution, the EU has embarked on 3 months of trade talks with Beijing. But with China committed to economic self-reliance and boosting production in clean energy and high-tech sectors, is there really any chance of a compromise? Well, today we're joined by Joerg Wuttke, for many years President of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, where he also worked for almost 3 decades as Vice President for China at the German chemicals giant BASF. Since 2024, he's been based in the US as a partner with the consultancy DGA Albright Stonebridge Group. He's also an advisory board member of Merix, Germany's leading think tank on China, and is often called on to give advice to German government officials, including to Chancellor Friedrich Merz ahead of his trip to Beijing earlier this year. So Joerg, thank you very much for joining us. We've just seen protests across Germany after Volkswagen Group, one of the country's biggest investors in China, announced plans to cut up to 100,000 jobs worldwide amid falling profits. So firstly, what does this tell us about China's impact on the German car industry?
What it indicates is not that the Chinese cars are basically taking over the European market, actually not at all. But of course, they go into a third markets, and that's used to be export out of Germany. And on top of it, of course, you have a non-competitive industrial landscape in Europe. And so Oliver Blume, the CEO, does the right thing. He wants to sort of align the capacity with the demand. So it's going to be crunch time. It's going to be difficult.
This plays very much into that whole debate and this whole discussion of the so-called China Shock 2.0 affecting Europe. But apart from the car industry, which sectors are you seeing the most direct examples of the impact of Chinese production in Germany at the moment? We hear about the impact on the so-called Mittelstand, which I believe is mainly smaller and medium-sized firms, some of these traditional family companies. Who is being affected, would you say?
Well, everybody that is basically overlapping with the 5-year plans of China. I did a study in 2016 on overcapacity in China, which then leads to exports. Because local consumption is not good enough, production is way too high, and that leads to the safety valve, meaning exports. And China gives us basically the advantage of knowing already 5 years ahead of time when they're going to roll over us where. So 16, I talked about steel, aluminum, and refining, and they all had overcapacity. And you can see that Europe put up tariffs on steel and aluminum. And then I did a study in 2017 as European chamber chairman. The study was called Made in China 2025. And I said there will be overcapacities because China's planning it in EVs, in batteries, in wind turbines, in solar, and basic chemicals. And voila, there we are today. So people have to really study these 5-year plans, not only where the business opportunities are in China, and there are plenty, but also where are the Chinese companies expanding and possibly over expanding, and then basically sending these items globally in the marketplace. And they are getting more and more high tech. So we talk about machinery, we talk about chemicals, we talk about all kinds of things where the Chinese basically, because of the lame consumption back home, have nothing else to do of putting them on the ships and sending them to Europe, because also exports to the US have been going down double digit as the US has imposed such high tariffs.
So you do see a very direct connection between Donald Trump's tariff wars with China and the sense of shock that appears to have really gathered pace in Europe and particularly in Germany over the last year.
Well, in many ways, he just adds to the pain. He's not the reason why the Chinese are exporting to Europe. They're exporting, again, not only into our home market, but also in third markets. The exports of machinery into the African continent has increased by 50%, certainly hollowing out our exports to Africa. You can see already now that also companies like Volkswagen are producing wonderful cars in China, and they get exported to Southeast Asia. Of course, trade unions, as of today, also will make sure that these cars don't enter the European Union in any sizable numbers. But definitely, these cars have to go somewhere. If you have a capacity of 50 million cars that you build, and you have only 23 million cars as local consumption, it has to go somewhere. And European companies are part of that. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen just have a perfect ecosystem in China, which they, of course, want to utilize and then put together as a car and export. But again, the problem for Germany as a nation is like, even if a German brand basically succeeds, what does it do to our industrial landscape? So we have a divergent interest of nations and economies on the one hand and companies on the other hand.
There has been some criticism in Germany of the German auto industry for being very much on the side of investment in China and not wanting to see tough action against Chinese exports and the overcapacity that you just referred to. I mean, how are people feeling now about the German car makers, considering that we're now talking about significant job losses in the industry domestically?
Well, the German car industry went into shock early 2023 after COVID when they realized when the German executives for the first time came to China after COVID, sanctions were lifted, they realized that the Chinese are not building cars anymore. They're building mobile phones on wheels. Hence, they have to basically change their own production. And that's why they're pouring billions into China and they're catching up. The Volkswagen has 20 new products on the market in China. 10 of them will never leave China. 10 will be exported primarily into non-European markets. And they are matching the price level of BYD. So the only way you can compete in China and in the third markets is if you produce in China. And that should be a wake-up call for our politicians back home is our market is too small in Europe. We still haven't scaled up. We still don't have the looser regulatory environment. We are stifled very often by green policies and we have too high energy prices. So in a way, these companies react very rational, but at the same time, it harms our economic landscape because they're closing down factories left and right and center. 10,000 jobs gets lost every month in the manufacturing landscape of Germany. And of course, something has to happen, and it has to be a reasonable transition period. And I guess that's the discussion today in Wolfsburg, how to do this.
There's been a report which has had a big impact in Europe, I believe, by the Centre for European Reform, an independent think tank, which was called China Shock 2.0. The Cost of Germany's Complacency by Sander Tordua and Brad Setzer. And they made the point that, you mentioned machinery, for example. They said that Germany used to dominate the global production of machinery and technology-intensive capital goods.
Yeah.
But since the middle of last year, Germany's been buying more capital goods from China than vice versa. So they're seeing this as a symbolic tipping point. Is there something specific like that which has, do you think, particularly scared people or galvanized people? This seems really to have gathered pace over the last year, this debate in Europe.
Well, it is partly because the German landscape in industrial matters has been eroding. We are lacking engineers. We are lacking demand. And China is not just producing soya sauce and ginger, they also produce wonderful machines. And that transition of China being an export market to China actually sort of matching our products in quality, certainly dominating it in quantity, is a new awareness in Germany, and hence Shock 2.0. But I must say that at the same time, China is not achieving this only because of its economic virtues, and that's where it becomes tricky. They also have overcapacities based on their state-owned enterprise landscape. Their currency in comparison to the euro is possibly undervalued by 25-30%. So in a way, European or German companies in particular find it very hard to basically compete against Chinese competitors because of these disadvantages. You can compare it to 1988 if you're old enough. 100 meters, Olympics in Seoul. It's the same 100 meters for Carl Lewis and Ben Johnson, but Ben Johnson had red eyes and was on steroids and won, of course. So in a way, German companies have to compete against companies which are subsidized partly and which definitely have a currency advantage, which is very hard to match on third markets.
And I mean, obviously, in some of these recent discussions, and in that Centre for European Reform report, for example, there have been a lot of suggestions that stiff action should be taken against China to raise tariffs on goods which are seen as having been subsidized, and that obviously there have also been calls for China to revalue its currency. But presumably at the moment that's something that's quite unlikely, considering that China is dealing with deflation domestically, and raising the value of the renminbi presumably would hit the economy, would certainly hit exports, which would be the point from the European point of view. What do you think will happen realistically? We're now seeing that the EU and China are going to talk to each other over the next few months.
Well, that's a good thing. I mean, I was privileged to brief Chancellor Merz before his China visit. I went to dinner with Merz in February, and we talked about the renminbi, we talked about trade imbalances, and I also briefed our Minister for Economic Affairs, Mrs. Katharina Reiche, last month before she went to Beijing, to actually give them a little bit of background, as both of them are not too familiar with China. And the Reiche visit actually was quite interesting, because when MOFCOM Minister Wang Wentao visited Brussels last week, she made the effort to see him again in Brussels. So the German minister flew to Brussels to talk to the Chinese minister there. But it's a good gesture.
That's the Chinese Minister of Trade who had come to Brussels to begin these negotiations, effectively.
Right. Yeah, you would expect him to go to Brussels and then to Berlin to meet member states, but she made the effort, which I think is nice, in order to actually tell him about the necessity of doing something on the renminbi, as well as constrain exports, given the subsidy background, but also given the fact that sentiment in Europe is rising to close the borders. Now, that's the tricky thing. It's easy to talk about it. It's very, very hard to do, because if Europe does something on tariffs on EVs, for example, like in September 2024, China has punished
when
France.
it introduced a sort of basic tariff on Chinese electric vehicles.
That was 10 to 20%, basically very small margins comparison to the US, so installed 100%. But the reaction was interesting, because it was sponsored partly by France, that China stopped importing cognac. And that hurts, of course, the French agriculture industry. And you can imagine the heat that Macron was under after they've done it. And so the problem we have is that whatever we do on China, China does something on us immediately. And so, if I install anti-dumping cases, safeguard, it takes 12 months, 24 months in order to have some impact. But China can respond right away and say, oh, I'm so sorry, licensing for rare earths, it's not working this time. And you want legacy chips for your car industry? Not really. And we have learned from rare earth how fast the impact is going to be and how hard it is to get out of this choke point. If legacy chips don't fly from China to Europe anymore, then the supply chain or car industry has to shut the factories within months. That means that then, because one little chip is missing, Mercedes-Benz can stop production of cars. So the time difference we have in infliction on pain on China and China inflicting pain on us is so different that we have to be very wise and smart about where do we protect ourselves without getting basically into the situation which for any economy would be impossible: no rare earth and no legacy chips.
The Centre for European Reform report addresses this question of if the EU were to raise tariffs against Chinese goods or take other measures to restrict China from certain sectors beyond what it's already done, that China clearly would retaliate. And in this CER report, they're actually suggesting that Europe should accept this, at least in the short term, and should prepare, a fund to compensate those domestic sectors who are affected from the revenue that it gains from any Chinese imports on which tariffs are slapped.
That is not feasible. Definitely not. I see the long-term ambition that we should have in developing with friendly countries rare earth industries, particular not just finding rare earth, which in essence are actually not very rare, to develop the refining technology and to accept the fact that this is actually very dirty and toxic, and that might take 5 years, 6 years.
But is there enough investment going into that sector? Because until the last few decades, most rare earths were produced outside China, but clearly China now dominates that market.
Yeah, because they
and
got
I
the
believe that the International Energy Agency have said that the West would need to invest something like $60 billion in order to produce rare earths to compete with China.
They would make it cheaper than the Iran war, so it should be feasible. We have rare earths all over the place. Yes, some of them have more in China, but our bottleneck is the refining capacity. We lack the technology, and we lack the willingness to say, okay, a lot of nuclear waste comes out of this process. A lot of chemistry is needed, which is toxic, and it doesn't look well. China accepted this, and that's why Inner Mongolia has these lakes of chemistry, which is polluting huge chunks of Inner Mongolia. But we did not accept this. It was fine for us that someone else is polluting elsewhere, and we buy the stuff, and this is over. So we have to get the technology going. We have to source with other countries. But again, this is not an easy thing to do. It might take 5 years. Some pessimists put it at 10 years. And then the legacy chips, it is just fact that China can basically stop the packaging and the testing of legacy chips, as it happened with Nexperia end of last year. That led to a shortage of legacy chips in the car supply chain. And if in Germany these chips don't come to our borders anymore, we have to shut down factories, which causes hundreds of thousands of jobs being challenged. And how do you want to finance this? Politically unsustainable. So in a way, we have to pour the money into production areas in Malaysia, in the United States, elsewhere to produce these legacy chips. So what I'm saying is, yes, we have to become less dependent on China, but we have to acknowledge that there's a time gap. I mean, the good thing about the Chinese, they never hide of what they want to do. Xi Jinping has said very clearly, China should become independent of the world, meaning the self-sufficiency discussion. and the world should become dependent on China, so China has political leverage. He said this, I think in 2012, 2013 already. So we simply didn't want to hear it. But now we have to learn the lessons. We have to pool. We have to find allies, which in these days is difficult because the US is an outlier. And do something about it. The other part where we have a strong, or used to have a strong dependency on China, was something that was on nobody's radar outside headquarters. That was the dependency on dividends coming out of China. The operations of European companies in China were so successful and so profitable that every year they could remit huge dividends to headquarters, which then patched over all these shortfalls of cash that were coming out of headquarters. And there you can use it in order to sort of keep factories going that actually should be closed. And on top of it, you make your shareholders very happy. And that avenue of fun has basically it's not over, but it has been definitely challenged.
In a way, that goes to the kind of counter argument that some people in China would definitely make, which relates to the idea that, Europe and Western companies and economies in general perhaps became quite complacent and were very happy to rely on China for cheap labor and, cheap products. And now that China has made massive investments in building up its own industry and its own innovation, which, it would see as completely legitimate and the type of thing that Western economies did in the past, the whole world is crying foul. And for example, I believe recently Li Qiang, the Chinese premier, said, we shouldn't be talking about China Shock 2.0. We should be talking about China Opportunity 2.0. Chinese media have said we should be talking about the China Gift 2.0, in other words, giving all these cheap products to the world.
Yeah.
You've obviously spent a lot of time in China. You talk to Chinese officials. I mean, you see both sides of this. Do you think that the Chinese officials are genuinely angry with the West and with the criticism, or do they know that it's part of the process?
I mean, they listen, of course, to what member states have to say, what Brussels has to say, and they do understand, of course, that we have an industrial hollowing out and something has to happen. But they also understand our weakness extremely clear, that we cannot live without the Chinese. We cannot do it without the legacy chips. We are dependent on pharmaceutical precursors. We're dependent on rare earths. China's wiggle room is also very, very small. From the four cylinders that drive the economy, urbanization is more or less flat. You have a construction and real estate sector which lost 50% of value, which has destroyed 14 trillion US dollars in household assets. And that, of course, has a dampening effect on consumption. Consumption is really weak in China. And that leads then basically to a situation where companies don't invest anymore. Fixed asset investment in China is very low with private enterprises, kept high on state-owned enterprises. So 3 out of 4 cylinders are really limping along. That leaves the fourth one, which is export. If I can't sell it in China, I sell it elsewhere, and that's where their advantage begins, and that's where our problem starts. And so in a way, it is something where China has to fix its own economy. We have, unfortunately, a perfect storm from many directions that have basically made life hell for European industrial leaders, as well as challenged us in many ways. Energy prices went up, courtesy to Putin's war in Ukraine. Second, COVID has basically disconnected us from China. We didn't see the Chinese rise in manufacturing. And then, of course, COVID has done major damage to the Chinese consumer sentiment. And hence, as they are planning economy, they keep producing, but they stopped consuming. It is a problem, and so in a way, it cannot only be blamed on European headquarters that they didn't see it coming. We didn't see the limping along and the economic challenges that China faces, and they will be more pronounced in the future. So we cannot assume that China will become a huge export market again for us.
But there has been, there is still talk in Europe of, people saying China really needs to take more measures to boost its domestic consumption. And obviously this is a topic that the Chinese Chinese leadership talks about, and it was discussed at the National People's Congress when they passed the new 5-year plan this year. But do you see any way that outside pressure can encourage China to take more measures to boost domestic consumption, or is that something that's really beyond other countries' capacity?
Well, if Mr. Wang and Mrs. Li lose half of their asset value in housing and apartments, they have to think about the future. That used to be, in many cases, the kind of old age support system. Then again, their kids, do they find the proper jobs in order to finance the family, in particular in the countryside? And consumption is very, very hard to generate in a nation that still has 900 million people that earn only $10 a day. We have a shining, sparkling Chinese economy with AI and robotics. We have the stock market doing well because 20% of the economy is doing well. And the normal population sees the other 80% of the economy, which is limping along. And basically, in view of the fact that China is the fastest aging country in the world, people are holding back. So there is not really anything that can help consumption immediately.
There's no way that
Well,
foreign companies or governments can put pressure on China over this type of issue.
Well, we have to talk about the renminbi euro exchange rate. China is a net exporter, but every Chinese individual is a net importer. It would give more firepower to the Chinese consumption if they would actually see the renminbi is worth more. They would maybe travel more. The imports become cheaper. The buying power of Chinese consumer goes up, and they would buy more, certainly. But again, China looks more into producing than into consumption, and they can't break that pattern.
And you see that as something that's kind of locked into the next 5-year plan, for example?
Yes, clearly. I don't see any appetite of China changing this game. Maybe
Yeah.
it has to get worse before it's getting better. I mean, it took Japan a long time in order to appreciate the yen. The yen was vastly undervalued in the late 70s, early 80s. Japan had massive overcapacity. They could be forced by the United States to change that. Nobody can force China.
So that was done in the 1980s with what was called the Plaza Accord,
Yes,
and there was
85.
Japan was effectively forced to revalue the yen. But
Yes.
you don't think that's possible this time with China?
No, nobody can put political pressure on China, not even the United States. Even Donald Trump is lame and tame. It's something where the domestic pressure in China has to rise before they can do anything about it. But we have to keep asking, we have to keep pressure on, and we have to find ways and mechanisms and actually safeguard some industries. So I'm not saying that we should not put up some tariffs on some items. I'm for it.
Because you've talked about some, I believe you describe them as temporary protection mechanisms, which you liken to a hydration break in a World Cup football match.
Exactly.
What specifically do you mean by that?
It could be volume constrained. It could be price floors. The car can only be sold at 100 and not at 50. Then maybe it's 1 million cars for the whole of Europe and not 5 million cars, this kind of thing.
Right.
The Canadians are testing this. McCartney has been implementing a system. I think it is an intermediate solution. And again, talking to the Chinese about the currency, the long-term direction of the currency clearly has to be appreciation. We see capital flight right now out of China for a good reason.
This is capital flight from Chinese people who are taking money out of the country.
Yes, because I mean, they have only two avenues of fund. One is the real estate sector. Again, if you lose 14 trillion US dollars, you might not see anything recuperating anytime soon. And then the stock market is very constrained. And so we have seen, like in 2015, 16, an incredible outflow of money. And China's trying to constrain that.
Do you think this could eventually encourage the Chinese government to consider letting the Chinese yuan appreciate?
I think it should be something they should ponder. The weak value in comparison to the euro. I mean, it's pegged to the US dollar. It has been appreciating a little bit towards the US dollars, baby steps, but it has to happen. There has to be something happening in order to constrain this. But it is something where we also will see the same mechanism that happened to Japan in the late 80s, 90s, when all of a sudden the yen went up and the domestic economy went limp. Japanese companies went global. And I think that's the big thing that people should watch. is Chinese companies will go global. They will buy into other companies. They will invest into other companies. And we have to see how we all deal with this, because even friendly Japan was at one stage perceived to be an invader. And China has a much lower political standing in most countries. So that's going to be very interesting.
But and, I mean, the question of Chinese investment in Europe has also been discussed, and as some people have suggested that what should be done is that rather than Europe importing huge
Yeah.
quantities of Chinese batteries or cars or energy-saving products, that many of these should be made in Europe, and Chinese companies should be effectively forced to
Yeah.
invest in Europe if they want to avoid high tariffs. And I believe we have seen some, for example, Chinese battery companies investing in Germany. Is that something we could see on a significant scale? And is Europe willing to allow that to happen?
Well, I think we should distinguish who is investing. We should definitely have a proper screening process when it comes to state-owned enterprises. Are they the real deal in order to actually bring jobs and value added to the European economy? I mean, we have seen the takeover of Pirelli, we have seen the takeover of Syngenta, Rhodia Silicon, for example, years ago by a company which was actually bankrupt, ChemChina, and now it's basically Sanochem, which is a good company. But at the same time, these
So are you saying that Chinese state companies should be prioritized, that they're more
scrutinized,
reliable than private companies, or are you
scrutinized.
saying that state companies bring different problems and that Europe needs to be aware of that?
Different problems, and we have to scrutinize them. We have to
Mm.
screen them, definitely, very, very tight. Also, in view of where I'm sitting right now in Washington, is we have to see that America is looking into European brands that have Chinese owners. We have seen Syngenta, the Swiss company in the chemical sector, that has been kicked out of Arkansas only for the fact that actually they are owned by a Chinese SOE. And we have seen Pirelli desperately trying to get rid of one of their Chinese shareholders because the Americans said, you know, you are in essence a Chinese SOE subsidiary, and hence you might be able to spy on us. We have seen challenges on Mercedes-Benz recently, very publicly. Two senators said, because two investors from China have a 19.8% stake in Mercedes-Benz, we should prohibit Mercedes-Benz to sell cars in America, believe it or not, you know. So companies in Europe have to wake up to the fact that sometimes a Chinese investor brings a lot of money, but actually it might impair its future business in the United States. But we should encourage Chinese companies, private enterprises, to invest in Europe. And they should do it not as a joint venture, which is in conflict with the Industrial Acceleration Act, which in many areas demands joint ventures. I'm totally against this.
That was the act introduced by the European Union
Commission.
earlier this year.
Yes, yes. It is a policy attempt which, in essence, is based on a very good idea by the EU Commission, DG Grow in particular, to say, okay, we want Chinese investment. How do we get them here? And it says, you know, you have to have a local content, which is a good idea. You have to basically procure locally and not just buy everything from China. And basically, you should be providing technology transfer in joint ventures. It's a bit like copying the Chinese 1980s, 1990s industrial policy. You know, it is a draft, so it's not final, and we have to see how that shapes up. But again, I'm all for Chinese private enterprises, 100% to invest in Europe. CATL is one of them. BYD is the other one. But again, they should be subject to the same kind of localization scrutiny that China has imposed on us.
Because I think there have been warnings by some people in Europe, you know, that if Chinese companies invest in significant firms in Europe, they're likely to just basically try and extract the best technology from those
Yeah,
companies and maybe let the
yeah,
European part of the production arm sort of
yeah.
gradually fall apart or slow down and take most of the production back to China. What do you think?
Well, again, CATL in Thuringia, Eastern Germany, BYD in Hungary. CATL is the largest battery producer in the world, and they produce for many car companies in East Germany. It's 100% private, and it is a greenfield project. They bring a new technology to us. They employ people. They teach these people how to do this. I'm all for it.
Hmm.
And again, the challenge that we face is if a Chinese company buys into, even a private company buys into a European brand, this might help this company in order to get the business generated, linking up to the Chinese market. But again, it has these two downsides. One is you might actually kiss goodbye to the US market because all of a sudden the US looks at you as a Chinese subsidiary. And second, again, will they suck out the technology knowledge from these companies and move it to China? In essence, will these companies that are bought by Chinese enterprises still generate as many patents as they did before? And that's a question mark. I don't know, but we should look into this. So in essence, yes, we should also entice Chinese entrepreneurs, venture capitalists to come into the European market and invest there. But the big but is, of course, are we still a great place to invest in? And if you ask European business leaders, they say not really. Energy prices overregulated, and so on and so on. And again, we have enough explanations of what has to be done. Prime Minister Letta from Italy has done it. The Draghi report is very famous. We know exactly
so that
what
was
to
by
do.
Mario Draghi, the former Italian prime minister, who looked at competitiveness in Europe and focused on the sort of lack of investment in research among European companies. Is that right?
Exactly. So we know what we have to do but we are just reluctant to do it because the pain level is not high enough, and it might actually sort of cause a difficult transition period. So in a way, we are having a China shock 2.0 because the Chinese became very good in innovation. But if you look into the innovation part, they never go from 0 to 1. They never actually invent anything new, but whatever is invented, they actually, and that's from 2 to 99 to 100, they actually make it better, cheaper, and faster and scale it up. China is world champion in development, and China is not really that good in research. We are still good at research. We, the OECD countries. So in essence, we have to see why that is the case. And it has to do with the fact that they have just this endless numbers of engineers. They have the deepest bench of engineers anybody can imagine. 50 out of the top 100 universities in chemicals are in China. 44 out of top 100 in the world on instrumentation is in China. We are lacking the engineers. And the second is we have only this kind of patchwork of a market in Europe. We are still not 27 united. And so we have to basically see that China is great at innovation because my formula is demand meets brain. They have 1.4 billion domestic demand and they have just endless numbers of engineers. So they have the large market scaling up effect, and they have the number of engineers to satisfy the fast response to market changes. So in a way, demand meets brain is innovation, and that's where we have to work on.
And
Again,
do you see a way that Europe can begin to take steps at least to try to compete in these areas? Or do you think Europe and China will just have to work together and make the best of their respective abilities and capacities?
well, I mean, we could lure Chinese entrepreneurs to come and work in Europe. There are many of them willing. 15,000 millionaires are leaving for Dubai, Paraguay, Singapore, and Tokyo. Why not Paris? Why not Aachen? Why not Milano? Now, in the context of 1.4 billion people, that doesn't sound like a lot, but these are the game changers. These are my former neighbors in Beijing. When I left in summer 2024, a third of the houses was dark at night, meaning these venture capitalists have left. And that is actually also something where we can learn from China. It's just like our venture capitalism is immature because for entrepreneurs, the risks are too high. We are a risk-averse society. And the US has shown us how risk capital can work. And we are still in bonds and in low grade investment. So we have to get our market, but we don't find the political consensus. We don't find the political narrative in order to get going. So to work with China, of course, we have to work with China. In China, to unlearn how to build cars and to learn how to build mobile phones on wheels, we have to sort of see if we can actually do something on making science more interesting in primary schools, secondary schools, and high schools. So in a way, we could learn from China a lot.
Do you see any way in which China can be pushed to open up its own domestic market further, given it's now so focused on promoting self-sufficiency in technology, for example?
Well, I founded the German Chamber in Beijing in 1999, and I was chairman of the German Chamber for a couple of years. And then I founded the European Chamber because we felt it
These are
mattered
chambers of
more.
commerce, yeah.
Exactly. So the combination, we were 51 companies that sat together and says, okay, let's lobby together as Europeans. And when I left as chair, it was 1,800 companies in 9 cities, So there was a demand, there was a success story going on. But at the same time, we felt that the Chinese are only opening up very few segments and otherwise just keep us busy on Sunday speeches with we're opening up and China's opening up. We coined this as promise fatigue. Meaning we were tired of all these nice talks. And you could see it from our annual product, which we as presidents had to launch every September in the European Chamber. The recommendations of European companies where China could actually improve, And, it was at the end very painful because we only 6 to 8% of our recommendations were sort of implemented. The rest was taken note of. And the size of the paper was growing. So when I left, it was 930 recommendations on solid 430 pages. And then basically my successor, Jens Esklund, when he had to launch his first report, it was 1,050 points. So from 930 to 1,050. So in essence, again, they have not really read the paper, or they had no political guts in order to change the domestic industrial landscape to open it up for European competitors, but actually got more problematic. So that is the environment. Our exports to China go down. We benefit in China the moment we become Chinese, meaning investors. But otherwise, China will not open up more. I really don't see this coming.
And in that context of the types of recommendations that you used to make and the reaction to them, do you think that there can be some serious outcomes in a positive sense from these talks between China and the European Union in the coming months? Or do you think perhaps that Beijing sees this as a way to delay any further measures by the EU?
Well, during my 10 years as chair of this European Chamber, I met very many serious Chinese decision makers that all understood. They all appreciated this report because it was an unbiased bottom-up reflection of what the Chinese landscape actually looks like. First and foremost, the person that really helped us a great deal was Minister of Commerce, Mr. Wang Wentao, the gentleman who went to Brussels last week and whom our economic minister from Germany met. Wang Wentao has been exceptionally open in order to approach these topics, but, he has a domestic landscape which is full of domestic protectionism. He knows exactly what the trade tensions do to him, his relationship with Europe. But at the same time, there are these local and regional SOEs in Jiangsu, in Zhejiang, and Guangdong who says, no, we're not going to open up, keep it closed.
And these are the state enterprises that still dominate certain key sectors.
So in a way, if you think that we have 27 member states and have trouble aligning them, China has 31 member states, meaning provinces. So in a way, I get it, but the heat is increasing. The appetite in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and Rome is rising to do something about China Shock 2.0. And I don't want this to escalate. Now we have a bit of a de-escalation until October, but can Europe really, in essence, influence China? Very, very little. But at the same time, we have to make China aware also of the fact that these policies that they have to our disadvantage are policies which in essence also hurt the economic fiber of China herself. Meaning overcapacity is not just a problem for us because we have to swallow all these machines, but also it leads to low margin or no margin in the industrial landscape of China. So actually the problems we are pinpointing at are their own problems and they should fix it. Otherwise, they're going to face a real serious situation and go into a sort of peak China situation, meaning flat like Japan did in the 90s and afterwards. So it's also in China's interest to read these reports and actually implement them, not just for the benefit of European business or exporters. It is actually something which we think is reform in a system which has run out of road.
Well, Joerg Wuttke, thank you so much for joining us on China in Context.
Thank you so much.
That's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about SOAS China Institute events and read our blog articles on our website soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.